people, and welcome to the latest episode of Reportercast, which is also the last episode for this season in October 2023. We're going to take a break and do some brainstorming and then return later on. And for today we have a very special edition. We're in Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital, and we're going to talk about the top issues at the intersection of the war and the financial sector. I was invited here by an excellent NGO from the United States called SUN, the Syria Ukraine Network, to talk about war crimes and accountability at a conference organized by them. And they're focusing on Syria and Ukraine and what these victims of aggression, these countries that, these people that became victims of aggression can learn from each other. And also, I'm talking about what the role of the financial sector can be in this situation, what the role of sanctions is, how sanctions are being implemented and what more can be done, where the loopholes are and so forth. My idea was that we are back in a world of cutthroat, great power competition, and we need to get better at making alliances with countries outside the West, outside the EU and the NATO sphere, if we're going to make the most of sanctions, because at the moment things are not great. They're patchy, to say the least. The Russian economy has adapted and they have created a war machine which is accelerating, if anything, and Putin is creating a war economy which gives me the impression that he wants to fight a war against the whole world, not just a war against Ukraine. And I think it's obvious sanctions have failed to prevent him from doing that. Kyiv is a beautiful city, it's got beautiful architecture, amazing people, parks, the pretty colors of autumn. It's as modern as most European cities, and it's not too far behind in terms of development from any main Western city. The people are heroes, they have a resilience that I admire very much. They have taken the Churchillian idea of keeping calm and carrying on to heart. But although I have eaten the food and drunk the drink, and I can vouch that they're fantastic as well, I have to say it's a tragedy to have a war of conquest inflicted on such an amazing people. And it's also because they're great, enterprising, resilient, and hopeful that they cannot and are not going to lose. And I think the future of Europe is in the East. But if you go out in the street and you look into people's eyes and in the train station and the supermarket, you see a great amount of suffering from this war. And they are suffering a lot more than they're telling us. They don't want us foreigners to know how hard things are for them. They want to stay strong and they want to keep fighting. But for me, I'm a bit of a crybaby. I tend to get emotional, and I can easily see how difficult it is for the Ukrainians and how much they are suffering. And I almost break down thinking that a massive killer missile can fall on my head in the hotel at any time, and I'm only here for 3 days. So imagine being here with your whole family and all your friends and loved ones all the time, to feel that danger. How strong do you have to be to live in this state of permanent danger? Nobody in the world should suffer like this. Ukrainians do not deserve it, and I'm starting to think it's also our fault, partly in the West, for not helping them more at the beginning. And I think they're absorbing a lot of pain and trauma just by being, and for me, just by being here a couple of days, I can see the hurt is very profound from what Russia has done to these people. And the ongoing crime by the Russian Federation will never be forgotten, I don't think, by Ukrainians, and nor should it be forgotten by anyone else. And that said, my specialty is finance and business, so I'm going to pull back the focus on that. And with us today is Andrii Mikheiev, who was patient to wait while I finish my introduction. He's a lawyer specialized in international law, and he was kind enough to make time for our little podcast. And we will discuss everything I mentioned. Welcome, Andrii.
Hi, Matei. It's very nice to meet you here.
Thank you. Thanks. Can you speak a little bit about your background, your life experience, your legal experience? Where were you when Russia started the war, and what are you doing today? You work also you should mention your NGO, the Center for Ukrainian Victory, and can you say a little bit about that as well, please?
Yeah, thanks. I'm from Donetsk, great city, which used to be a great city at the east of Ukraine, and it was in a very pro-Russian environment since my early childhood. and I am very surprised how could my mind survive and still keep to be a Ukrainian patriot. Then I moved to Kyiv, and I was studying international law, so I became an international lawyer, and then I decided to pursue my way and to continue being an international lawyer. And in these hard times, my profession appeared to be very useful. So I suffered from war with the Russian for more than one time, because first in 2014, pro-Russian forces, pro-Russian terroristic groups, they took over my native city and the whole region, and they proclaimed their so-called People's Republic, republics there, and it really influenced my family and my life in a lot of times. And after that, the full-scale invasion of Russian army appeared. At that time, I was in Kyiv, and I saw and I heard everything with I saw everything with my own eyes. I heard everything with my own ears, and I took active participation. And I decided to put my best contribution, my best professional contribution, into fighting the aggressor and into bringing the truth from the professional background to the international community, to help them understand how dangerous is this aggressor and how cynical are its violation of international law, and that all of the states should join together in joint efforts and combat it. Currently, I'm working for the International Center for Ukrainian Victory. It's the Ukrainian civic platform founded by prominent Ukrainian NGOs, which is specialized on advocating the interests of Ukrainian victory and of Ukrainian survival, if we are talking seriously, on the international level. And they are lobbying the decisions about taking the criminals from Russian Federation to liability, for condemning Russia and Federation as a state for its violation of international law, for taking economic and political measures to help Ukraine and to support its military forces and to ensure its survival in this war, because really Russia is a very powerful enemy, and without international support, Ukraine could not have stand it alone.
Right, right. And yesterday during the conference, you mentioned there was a connection between the abuses of human rights that the Russian army has already committed in Ukraine, war crimes, and the possibility of the confiscation of financial assets from private players also, and the sovereign. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Yes, sure. The confiscation of assets would be a fair measure to compensate for all the damage, not for all, because currently damages and losses are much higher than the whole amount of assets, of Russian assets ever in the world, and this number may increase, unfortunately. But this would be a fair measure to compensate a part of losses and damages which Russia inflicted, and Russian military forces, Russian politicians, and Russian financial players who are financing this cruel war. So, if we are talking, these two topics should be discussed separately. So, if we are talking about private assets, in Ukraine we already have a law which provides for confiscation of assets of persons who are linked to the commencement of war and financing the war and making propaganda in favor of such war through sanctions. First, the assets are blocked through a particular sanction, and then, due to the court decision, after the fair due court procedure, they may be confiscated. And as of today, we have more than $1 billion already confiscated in favor of Ukrainian state and Ukrainian nation. But of course, it's just peanuts, because there are a lot more of private assets of Russian oligarchs, Russian propagandists, who play a serious role in this Russian aggression, and they should be confiscated. It's a very complicated issue, because it's linked with the right to property. It's linked with a difficulty to prove this connection and to prove this intent, for instance, to finance the war, finance the aggression, and to gain something from this aggression. However, our partners are already elaborating instruments like confiscation as the punishment for evasion of economic sanctions, confiscation as a direct economic punishment. We know about the draft of the draft of the EU directive, and we also know about the Canadian law on special economic measures, which covers both states and private persons. And actually, as of the end of the previous year, the US have already confiscated $5 million of the Russian oligarch and directed it to Ukraine. But of course, it's just a drop in the sea, as we say it in Ukraine. The situation requires much more decisive action. So this is about private assets. If we talk about the sovereign assets, mainly the assets belonging to the central bank foreign currency reserves, which are located majorly in the EU countries, especially in France and Germany, but also in the US and in Canada.
Right.
Currently, the situation is also very difficult in this regard, although our partners show their decisive position in elaborating these instruments, but there are a lot of legal and political and economic obstacles to it. I think we may talk about it in more details later, but in my opinion, that would be a really fair measure, considering the grave violations of international law by Russia as a state, because war crimes, crimes against humanity, the genocide they are committing, especially in aspect of deportation of children, the violation of the UN Charter, the violation of the International Court of Justice preliminary ruling, all of this may be considered as not just violation of international law in general. It's like violation of the peremptory, the imperative rules of international law, the rules of the higher class, which are recognized as mandatory for all the nations and which may not be interpreted in different ways. So I think it's fair enough.
Right. So here you mentioned the deportation of children, clear crime. There's even there's a search, an arrest warrant against Putin and his ombudsman for children for this specific crime. It pertains to one definition of genocide, which is to erase the identity of these children, transport them to Russia, and create new Russians.
Yes, exactly.
So this is a crime.
Sure.
So on the basis of this, and on the basis of other war crimes such as bombing civilian infrastructure, which again they talk openly, the commanders, the political leaders, they talk openly about how they want to bomb specifically civilian infrastructure in order to weaken the Ukrainian nation. So from this, how do you get legally from this, which is quite obvious, quite an obvious crime, to confiscation? Because Euroclear is the clearinghouse in Brussels, and they said they are open to transferring the profits from the assets of the Russian Federation, but the profits are being created because they have assets that attract interest. So they can transfer that, but the underlying assets they don't want to transfer. So can you explain that a little bit?
Yes, of course. You know, when we talk about these particular crimes, international crimes, we should differ a state, Russia as a state, and particular persons, because an international crime may not be committed by state. It may be committed by a person, by a Russian soldier, by a Russian officer, or by a Russian politician who made a decision or who made, I don't know, some order which is implemented in such a way. So when we're talking about genocide, when we're talking about war crimes, we may talk about the criminal liability of particular persons and confiscations of their private individual assets as a criminal punishment. For instance, if the Rome Statute provides for the confiscations, for paying fines, and for compensated to damages for criminals. But when we are talking about violations committed by the Russian Federation, it's as a state, it's a violation of the UN Charter, the prohibition to use the force against other states, and also general prohibitions of its obligations under the Geneva Conventions, which regulate the rules of behaving regarding civil population in this regard. So a state may not commit a crime. These are different subjects. And the confiscations regarding Russia in this regard may be replied within the international legal liability of state, not international criminal liability. These are two separate issues. When we're talking about the Euroclear and about this, I think we already may talk about the main legal barrier from the viewpoint of international law to confiscate Russian state assets. It's the sovereign immunity doctrine. It's the international custom which provides that a state may not confiscate, seize, or in any other way alienate the property of foreign state by decision of its own domestic court. It's an international custom, so it means that the states universally have such an opinion that it must be done so, and they have the state practice. Moreover, this international custom was confirmed by the practice of International Court of Justice. In 2012, and for International Court of Justice, this is like yesterday, because they are considering cases for a very long time. In 2012, they made a judgment in a dispute between Germany and Italy regarding confiscation of German state property by Italian courts, and they found out that even German grave violations of international law during the Second World War, which happened in Italy, they may not be a basis for confiscating German state property through decisions of national court to compensate for the relatives of victims. And the ICJ even ruled to reinstate, cancel these decisions and reinstate their German right of property. So in this regard, international law used to be very strict. Even violation of international humanitarian law, even violation of international human rights law may not be a basis for violating the sovereign immunity of states. So the international custom says. There are no active international conventions, treaties. We had the UN Convention on Jurisdictional Immunities of State, but it didn't come into force because it lacked ratifications. We had European 1972 Convention, but it has only 8 parties, so it's just a regional instrument. But they are respected as a codification of international custom, and currently it exists as is. And that's why European Union states are still afraid of violating this, because to their opinion it would be a grave violation of this international custom, and it would create a dangerous precedent, and it would make international law as nothing. But for me, this argument is very disputable, and I may tell my own opinion, an opinion of a lot of great international law is much more prominent than myself. Why it's not so?
Right. So this is still being debated. It's still being talked about. Nothing is settled. And of course, while this is happening, Putin is making a mockery of international law every day, and he's confiscating foreign companies in Russia, and he's giving them to oligarchs, and he's creating a new class of oligarchs. So, some people are very strict about following the rules, while the rest just don't care, and they're very proud, actually, that they don't follow the rules. And that brings me, actually, again, you mentioned the oligarchs, and you mentioned how you want to confiscate specifically from those oligarchs that have supported the war, that are financing the war. So, can you get into this a little bit? What would be a threshold? Because at one end, you have Malofeyev, the orthodox fascist oligarch who is sponsoring propaganda, he's sponsoring the war and so forth, and he had his assets frozen and in some countries even confiscated. But at the other end, you've got Oleg Tinkov, the banker, who also was on the sanctions list, and he condemned the war. He gave up his assets in Russia, and he got off the sanctions list now. So now he's a free man. So can you get into that a little bit? What would be the threshold?
Yes, sure. Of course, Ukraine doesn't want the confiscation of every Russian in the world based only on like Russian origins or Russian citizenship. Of course, there should be the real intent established of financing and of supporting this war of aggression of Ukraine, and also the connection between investments made by such person and the consequences of the war. For example, if we're talking about oligarchs who have shares in Russian defense and military works and plans, and if we have data that their money and their further investments were used to to product much more drones, to product more missiles and artillery weaponry, which then will shell and totally destroy Ukrainian cities and Ukrainian people. Of course, it will be enough basis to consider that this man or this oligarch is really supporting this war of aggression in Ukraine, and his or her assets should be confiscated. But in reality, it's very hard to establish, because these people are very smart and they have a lot of proxies through which they are executing
what
formally.
we call wallets in Eastern
yes.
Europe. They
Yes.
have people acting as their human
Yeah.
wallets.
Exactly, they have such wallets, and all the Russian politicians, they have wallets, and it's very hard to establish first that this property really belongs to them, and second, their specific intent. However, the European countries, the USA, Canada, other countries have already imposed sanctions on such people. The prohibition to trade, the prohibition to they froze their assets, prohibitions to establish business, and so on. And currently, really, the evasion of such sanctions, when such people try anyway to continue their activities, is considered as the best basis for applying more severe punishments regarding them, including confiscation of assets. But actually, to my personal opinion, as of now, issue of confiscation of Russian sovereign assets is much more perspective.
Right, okay. And I have a broader question now about international law. What new international law, treaties, conventions should be created, in your opinion, from what we've seen that the Russian Federation has done to Ukraine? It's pretty clear, and there's a lot of coverage of this, that the United Nations is dysfunctional, to say the least. It did not prevent this war. It did not prevent the Syrian war and many other aggressions. So what should be done? I mean, we need to create something to make international law relevant, right?
Well, to my opinion, I made all my ideas. I can't say that they are very realistic, because they may be implemented only if states will somehow waive their understanding of their sovereignty, waive their understanding of their own political interests and will, and I don't really believe in this. But actually, the whole system, system of international defense should be restored. For instance, the situation when the main international perpetrator, Russia, is a permanent member of the Security Council, the only UN authority which can make really coercive decisions and which can make apply really effective measures, and Russia may block any decision by its veto power. To my opinion, this makes this whole institution very ineffective. And of course, the UN Charter should be revolutionary amended in this way. Also, the issue of states' immunity in cases of the grief violations of international law should be reconsidered, because, in my opinion, if state sovereignty is placed above even the highest standards of international law, the human rights, the prohibition to use the force, which means the prohibition to start war, yes, the prohibition to make an aggressive war, I think in this way there is no sense in international law at all. This whole approach should be reconsidered, and it should be implemented in a new international instrument, international conventions, which shall be voluntarily signed by all the states, as well as the rules on international legal responsibility of states, and on measures which can be applied against states who are not eager to bear this international legal responsibility. Because currently they are all existing just in a form of drafts prepared by the UN authorities in the form of international customs, which are not binding actually.
Right. So
states
tear all of it down and start from the beginning. And on sanctions, countries have different views of sanctions, different ways of applying sanctions methodologies. In some cases, one asset that is attached to a person who's sanctioned is considered sanctioned, but in another jurisdiction it might not be considered sanctioned. So there are many discrepancies. Can you tell me the main shortcomings of sanctions policy in countries that are more closely allied to Ukraine, the EU, the UK, the US? Where do you see the problems with their sanctions policy, and any solutions?
Well, the European Union, the US, applied sanctions against Russia since 2014. And this showed that sanctions are really ineffective instrument, because since then Russian GDP even raised, the economy really adopted, as you said at the beginning in your introduction, and all businesses got used to it, because they also have global south who is eager to partner with them and who is dependent in many ways on the Russian resources. And they have a lot of private partners in Western countries which help them to evade these sanctions. The main disadvantage of sanctions is that, first, these are the temporary instruments, and second is that all Western states, they of course try to make it extremely legitimate and legal from all sides it's possible, and that's why a lot of sanctions, a lot of freezing of assets, a lot of bans and embargoes were later dropped by the sanctioned persons. For instance, former Ukrainian president Viktor Yanukovych, who fled to Russia. They were dropped in court, and all the money returned back to them. So, considering the scale of Russian aggression and its consequences, it's estimated officially in more than $400 billion as of today. It's much more than the whole amount of Russian assets, private and sovereign, placed in the whole world. Sanctions are not adequate and equal countermeasure, and it would be fair if the international community goes further and applies some much more effective, for instance, whole and irrevocable confiscation of Russian sovereign assets, directing them to Ukraine, and according to the mechanism, compensate for their own damages, because not only Ukraine is suffering from Russian aggression, a lot of Ukrainian partners are suffering as well.
Also, Moldova, we should say,
Yes.
its economy was destroyed it had to take millions of refugees, and it's one of the poorest countries in the world. So there's that. Now, final question. You work at the Center for Victory.
Yeah.
So the vision is victory, getting rid of the Russian army from Ukrainian territory, and continuing after that. What is the vision for after? Let's say, one day will be Victory Day. No, the Russian army retreats from Ukraine. What is the vision? From this is when military combat stops, presumably, and then new things happen. What is the project?
Well, you influenced my answer with your question, because you said one day it shall be a victory when the Russian army leaves Ukraine. Well, in this scenario, and unfortunately it's the most realistic scenario of the Ukrainian victory, when Russian army just leaves its territory, but still Russia continues to exist as a state which is used to be before, and with the same political leadership. And in this case, I cannot say that the global threat shall disappear. It shall still be locate near the Ukrainian borders, and in that way, of course, Ukraine shall restore all the damages which Russia have occurred, but also Ukraine should after that be in constant and in a permanent readiness for the next war. So it shall require support of its army and development of its army, of its technologies, of its military resources, and really turn into the military country. And in my opinion, in order to really establish peace and security in the region and in the world, because Russia is a really global threat to the world, leaving Ukrainian territory is not enough for the victory. Real victory would be first if the Russian Federation is occupied by the Allied forces, and it's restored, remade. But it's not realistic.
I don't believe that's realistic at all.
I understand your sarcasm regarding your
sorry,
skepticism.
I don't mean. I'm more than a little bit skeptical, but not sarcastic.
Me as well, actually. But I'm just theorizing about that. And or the second way, if political leadership in Russia, due to the internal process change, and the new leadership is coming into negotiations about establishment a new model of relationship in the region.
I think that is possibly more realistic, to work with Russian opposition, to work with the Russians that are clear Putin should go, the regime should change, and enable them to change their own country, because I cannot imagine any other foreign country going into Russia. So anyway, I mean, is there a project in Ukraine to engage with the Russians who want to get rid of Putin?
No, currently we are only focused on survival and on our victory. It's actually, unfortunately, it's really far as of now from being a real perspective. And although we are making a great success, but Russia has now launched a long war scenario, and it has much more resources. It has much more missiles and everything than Ukraine. So that's why we need support to survive. Because in this scenario, it's almost impossible to win. We need partners, and we need allies, really. And that's what we are thinking about. And the second thing is that we are currently, from my viewpoint, as a person who is advocating Ukrainian interests, and who even often participates with the Russian opposition leaders in the same events, I can say that currently there is a lot of skepsis regarding them as well, because first they are not, they don't have like common position. They do not seem to be united. Each one of them is trying to take on the leadership position, either Kasparov or Navalny and his deputies who are who are not in prison, and or Khodorkovsky. They are like looking in different sides, and they are not acknowledging the necessity to unite.
So first they need to start working together more
Yes,
closely.
of course, and moreover, considering the former expressions of some of the Russian oppositions, we may now say that yeah, they are great patriots of Russia, but shall they waive Russian imperialistic interests regarding Ukraine?
You're not clear on that.
We are not clear on that. I mean, in case they take on the leadership in Russia, we're not clear on that. Exactly.
Okay. All right. Well, let's leave it there. So, conclusion is Ukraine continues to be in survival mode, right? And so things are very, very serious. Continue to be very, very serious. Thank you very much, Andrii Mikheiev, lawyer specialized in international law here in Kyiv, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Matei. That was great to talk to you.
Thank you.